The internet has a terrible habit of turning niche video game franchises into an academic chore. If you spend more than 5 minutes looking at the JRPG discourse on YouTube or Reddit, you will inevitably run into a very specific ravenous breed of gatekeeper. It's a phenomenon heavily preserved in communities like the Kingdom Hearts fandom, but its absolute peak is found within the Trails community. The narrative is always exactly the same. Do not touch the new game. You cannot appreciate the new game unless you go back and play through 11 previous titles, absorb 800 hours of historical backstory, and memorize a sprawling fictional timeline first. It is completely ludicrous. More than that, it's actively suffocating the exact series these fans claim to love. For all of the massive word-of-mouth noise this fandom generates online, a brand new Trails launch rarely breaks 4,000 concurrent players on Steam. If your goal is to spread the word and grow a community, telling a curious newcomer that they have to face a 900-hour barrier to entry before they can enjoy a new release is the fastest way to kill outside interest entirely. There is a very clear reason why Falcom's own marketing explicitly states that each Trails release is a perfectly valid entry point for beginners. Now, does it help to know the deep lore? Obviously, but if a player falls in love with the current title, they're going to naturally loop back and explore the older games anyway. I know this because I'm the exact demographic the purists warn you about. Personally, I play media in the absolute worst order imaginable. I started Metal Gear Solid franchise with Ground Zeroes, moved to the Phantom Pain, and skipped back to Metal Gear Solid 4 and finished with 3. And I thoroughly enjoyed every single second of it. Why? Because a good piece of art will always be a good piece of art, regardless of the sequence in which you consume it. The internet heavily minimizes a human being's natural ability to infer context. Before I touch any game, I read reviews and watch videos to see if the core identity interests me. That is all the baseline context you need. Any gaps in my concrete knowledge during Daybreak were incredibly easy to bridge through simple context clues and structural implications. I was never lost. Good writing trusts the audience to put the pieces together, and telling people they need a syllabus before they can press start is an insult to the intelligence of the average player. My relationship with this franchise started with a string of failures. Over the years, I tried picking up Trails in the Sky, Trails of Cold Steel 1, and Trails of Cold Steel 3. I dropped every single one of them before hitting the 7-hour mark. The introductions to those specific eras are an absolute glacial crawl. They demand a massive upfront investment of patience for a narrative engine that takes dozens of hours just to start moving. When I first booted up Trails through Daybreak, I almost repeated the cycle, dropping it after just 1 hour. But Trails titles always start slow, and when I finally forced myself to give it a fair second chance, the game completely trapped me. I literally could not put it down, playing day after day until the credits rolled after 60 plus hours of playtime. Daybreak features the single best introductory arc Falcom has ever written, and because it successfully respected my time, it did something that the Gatekeeper lecturers never could. It gave me the exact push I needed to want to go back to the beginning. Beating this game made me want to pick up Sky first chapter and experience the roots of the universe. The hardcore fanbase views skipping ahead as a betrayal of the experience. They assume that when a legacy character like Fee shows up on screen, a newcomer's immersion will shatter because they didn't soy jack at the monitor or burst into tears of nostalgia. But that isn't how real people experience storytelling. When Fee appeared, I didn't need 4 games of emotional baggage to understand her role. My reaction was simply, oh shit, it's Fee. When the narrative constantly references the political and criminal aftermath of the Crossbell arc, it didn't alienate me or annoy me because Daybreak is a story that deals heavily with underground mafia factions and corporate espionage. Those historical nods felt like brilliant, mysterious pieces of environmental world building. It made the universe feel lived in and massive, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that makes me actively want to see what happened in Azure rather than feeling like an inside joke I wasn't invited to. The core reason Daybreak succeeds so violently as a standalone experience comes down to a fundamental subversion of the franchise's traditional tropes, specifically the contrast between its new protagonists and the shadow of the old ones. For a decade, the online face of this franchise was Rean Schwarzer. The major issue with the Cold Steel era is that Rean's entire personality is rigidly defined by the fact that he is the quintessential chosen one anime hero. He's the ultimate main character, positioned at the center of an empire's military institutions and royal politics. It creates a narrative framework where the world must constantly revolve around his moral righteousness, making standard suppression of disbelief incredibly difficult if you aren't entirely brought into that specific archetype. Van Arkride is a massive immediate upgrade. Van is 24 years old, an adult with an established cynical worldview operating as a gray market fixer in a rapidly changing, modernizing democracy. His position as a Spriggan is the ultimate narrative tool for a newcomer because he isn't a wide-eyed student learning how the world works. He already knows exactly how corrupt it is, and he's just trying to pay his office rent. The dynamic of the Arkride Solutions office feels grounded because the cast he picks up along the way actually serves to pull out different dimensions of his character development, rather than just inflating his ego. Now, to be entirely fair, if you strip away the lore armor, the party characters themselves are initially quite tropey, with the exception of Agnes and Quattro, who carry the most immediate emotional depth. The rest of the main office crew doesn't fully flesh out their complexities until later entries, but the strength of Daybreak's writing lies in how it respects the secondary cast. I was genuinely surprised by how minor characters like the arrogant actor Maxim were woven into the larger late-game narrative. In a lesser JRPG, a character like that is a throwaway, one-note gag used to fill a single subquest. In Daybreak, Falcom demonstrates an incredible commitment to making sure every moving part of the city of Edith feels like it has a purpose, ensuring that Van's adult street-level perspective remains completely fascinating from start to finish. We cannot talk about why Daybreak hooks a player without talking about how it completely visualizes its pacing shift through its gameplay mechanics. For years, traditional turn-based JRPGs have struggled with a major identity crisis. How do you keep the tactical depth of classic combat without making exploration feel like a mind-numbing, outdated slog? Daybreak's solution is a mechanical triumph that more turn-based games desperately need to copy. By implementing a hybrid system where you can seamlessly smash through mobs using real-time field hacking action, before dynamically dropping a shard barrier to transition into a traditional turn-based grid, Falcom completely solves the genre's pacing problem. We saw high-profile titles like Metaphor Re Fantasio attempt to mimic this exact structure later on. But because Falcom has decades of pure action pedigree through its Ease series, their execution here feels significantly tighter, faster, and more tactile. It is a loop I infinitely prefer over the hyper-stylized hybrid approach of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, because it perfectly honors what makes turn-based design great in the first place. I love turn-based combat because it feels two distinct slots in my gaming brain. On one hand, when you're running through the standard areas or grinding out upgrades, it can be a beautifully mindless process, allowing you to go through the motions, appreciate the fluid animations, and comfortably chat with friends while making a steady progress. On the other hand, the moment you step into a major boss encounter, the system immediately shifts gears into an engaging high-stakes tactical puzzle where positioning, delay mechanics, and S-craft timings actually matter. The only real mechanical wildcard here is the Grendel transformation. On paper, a tokusatsu-style armored superhero transformation feels like a forced gimmick that shouldn't fit into a dense political JRPG, but because the game treats it as an earned narrative payoff, directly tied to the dark hidden elements of Van's past, it works beautifully as a high-impact mechanical anchor to the game's biggest fights. This brings us to the ultimate paradox of Trails Through Daybreak, and the real reason why its presence on the internet feels so entirely disconnected from reality. If you look back at the history of YouTube video essays on this series, the Cold Steel arc completely dominates the digital landscape. There is a massive, incredibly loud wave of nostalgia for that specific era of the franchise. Yet when you look closely at the data, an incredibly weird trend emerges. When the fans who grew up playing Cold Steel on their PS3s and PS Vitas, the one driving the vocal online sentiment, seem to have hit a wall of massive franchise fatigue by Cold Steel 4. When Daybreak arrived with its brand new engine, a faster release cadence, and significantly higher critical reviews, that older audience simply never came back to buy it. The internet's vocal minority creates a complete illusion of what commercial success actually looks like, where highly praised global releases like Wise 10 struggle to pull in concurrent numbers past a few hundred players, and major remakes like Sky First Chapter open to modest digital crowds. To an outsider, it looks like a dead franchise, but the reality is that Falcom is currently experiencing a historic financial success, driven by a massive explosion in global licensing rights and smart multi-platform distribution across console markets that Steam metrics completely ignore. They are an indie-sized studio running on a low overhead budget, meaning they don't need Final Fantasy numbers to thrive. They can afford to make a game that visually looks like 2 generations outdated because the core writing and mechanical loop are fiercely optimized for their specific niche. To be completely honest, Trails Through Daybreak can occasionally feel like a chore to get through. It is an incredibly dense, text-heavy experience that essentially demands you read a massive novel while playing a JRPG. It is a style of game that on paper is completely outside of my usual preferences. Yet it possesses a magnetic, undeniable quality that forced me to return to it day after day, demanding at least an hour of my time until it was finished. It is a uniquely compelling piece of art. The gatekeepers who insist you must survive 1,000 hours of historical context before you're allowed to touch it are completely wrong. They are gatekeeping an entry point that was custom built to save the franchise from its own narrative bloat. My upcoming playthrough order is going to be completely unhinged. I'm moving straight into the sequel, Beyond the Horizon, and then looping all the way back to the beginning of the Sky trilogy once the second chapter remake drops. It is the absolute worst order imaginable, and is going to be absolute